I'm mad. And if you're wondering why I'm mad, it's because you're either not subscribed to our channel or it's because my dad almost got fished. And I say almost, but he's a pretty clever guy, especially when it comes to security, and he said his gut felt off about that. And his gut was absolutely correct in this instance. The reason why I'm mad about this is because it was such a targeted campaign that required intimate knowledge about how the Alabama Community College system made a merger 2 years ago that even looking as fishy as the Google form link eventually resolved towards, it probably still got a few victims. So I wanted to ensure that even if they did get some victims, we polluted their data set and wrecked their shit and made sure that, well, nothing could be obtainable from that info. So we utilized Selenium to accomplish just that for us.
So before we look at the actual code, I want to show the little data library I compiled with some helper functions just to make it a little easier to create a lot of randomized data, and hopefully this gives you some ideas as well. So I have compiled, I found a list of the 10,000 most frequently utilized passwords. That was just a text file I found on GitHub, and I just did some string manipulation to make it an array of strings, and I've got that saved as passwords.json. I also compiled a list of first names, last names, and phone numbers, and for the phone numbers I mapped over those, and I removed the first three characters, and that way I could substitute my own local area codes just because I want to give the most legitimate looking local data for this. And this is just my, replication of what I utilized previously. So I actually had a lot more data, but as far as schools go, I took a few dozen colleges from the state of Alabama because, yet again, I wanted to keep everything local. And I grabbed their host name so I could use that for generating emails. And then I created an array of names that were, both the official and informal names for the university, just so I could get some diversity from that aspect. I have a little helper function get random from that takes an array and returns a random item from that array. I have a function get odds from that you will pass in a number between 1 and 100, and it gives you a boolean on whether or not math.random exceeded that. So this is really helpful for just some random entropy, and I utilize that really heavily in this get email function. So with this get email function, I have it accepts the first name, last name, and the university's host name. I have 50-50 odds on whether or not the first name is listed out fully or whether or not it is just the first letter of that. There's a 20% odd the first name and last name are separated via an underscore. There's a 60% odd that the last name is truncated, and if the last name is truncated, then there is going to be between 5 and 8 digits as the substring, index. Then whether or not there are numbers included at the end, it's a 60% chance, and that number that's included at the end will be a number between 1 and 20. So overall, if I were to represent Andrew Cartwright, it might be A underscore CART, 15 at, some university.edu. So I particularly like this, and I did some other, helper and randomization functions for the other attributes, but this is just kind of a quick replication of what I utilize just as kind of a way of maybe helping inspire you guys to how you can get randomized data to either, fill out your own data sets with test data, or if you're doing this to help combat spam. And then finally we have my generate function here, which just gets a random first name, random last name, a random password, a random phone number, which it generates from getting a random phone and then getting one of my random local area codes and combining them together so it looks just like a regular local number. And then I get a random school for the second school because of the way this form was targeting people. It was asking for their Jefferson State credentials, the school that was being targeted, and any other schools that you may have attended. And then I have some of the get odds function doing some extra conditional stuff here. So if they reuse passwords, there is a 40% chance they do. If they reuse their phone number, there's a 60% chance that they, just use the same phone number. It might not be an employee, it might be a student, so it might not be an office phone, it might just be a cell phone or something. And then I have a few objects here, email, password, and phone, just making a distinction between, the main school's email, password, and phone. And then for the, secondary school, the alternate email, the alternate phone, and alternate password. And those, we use these ternaries to say like, hey, if they reuse one of those, well, they just take on the value of the main one. Otherwise, we just get a new one. And that gives us this little construct here, which creates a nice little user object. And I export from this file a user object with this generate function and a helpers object, my get random from and get odds from functions. And I probably won't use those, but this user generate function is going to be really, really helpful. I might decide to maybe modify this a little bit, but overall it's looking pretty good. And the reason why I'm doing so much randomness is because I wanted to make this seemingly like as pattern free as possible, as least predictable as possible, just so that it would be really hard to separate my data from legitimate victims' data. And that means if they were trying to use some kind of like regular expression to maybe match some patterns, sure, they could probably get a large swath of my data, but they would still leave a large bit intact. And for whatever they did delete of mine, they likely would delete legitimate users' data as well. So that's kind of a, the reason why I want this to all be so randomized. But, like I said, for real production, I actually had, a lot more, a few dozen schools versus 3 here. And then I also, in addition to the random odds, I would sometimes select no, they hadn't attended another school in the state of Alabama, and would just leave off that secondary information. So this is a little data set, and then we can go ahead and take a look at how we can create the actual Selenium code to get that terrible, terrible form filled out with a bunch of junk data. So I know we didn't get to Selenium quite yet for this first part. And if you want to see that, then make sure you're subscribed so you get notified when part 2 comes out. But otherwise, this data library is so critical to the entire process. If you make it look as real and as legitimate as possible, then it basically becomes impossible to separate out your data from legitimate victims. If they try to use some kind of like regular expressions to, maybe pattern match some of your emails, well, sure, they might delete a large swath of your data, but that means that they will likely also delete a large swath of real victims' data. And if they go a little less aggressive, they might lose fewer legitimate victims, but that also means that they lose fewer fake users that you submitted. So no matter what, we still have a really effective way of wasting their time just by creating a bunch of false leads that just makes their entire data set useless at that point. So, like I said, if you want to see part 2 of this video, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in that installment.